We're delighted to have the former Irish ambassador to the United States, Dan Mulhall, who is an expert in Irish culture, literature, and the deeper roots of Irish identity, speak to us now about AE and his place in Irish public life. So I'll yield the floor, please. Warm round of applause for Dan Mulhall.
Thank you very much for those words of introduction, it's great to be here. I suppose before we talk about AE, we should talk about AI. I mean the All Ireland and Armagh. I think the great man was looking down from the mystic realm and urging on the lads from Armagh who I'm delighted because I like to see counties that don't often appear at Croke Park making an appearance there the odd time. And Waterford, of course, my home county, which is cursed. It's not, we're not like Mayo, we don't know what the curse, there must be one on it because we haven't won the All Ireland since 1959. So I've been interested in AE for a long time, and I thought, for most of my life, I thought I was the only one that had that interest, and I thought otherwise, the man had been forgotten largely, and that's why I'm delighted to come across this group of people who are enthusiastic about and want to commemorate and celebrate the life and legacy of George Russell. So I published a book there last year called Pilgrim Soul, W.B. Yeats and the Ireland of his time. I did it to coincide with the centenary of Yeats' Nobel Prize. I'm also, by the way, the honorary president of the Yeats Society in Sligo, so I've had a long-standing interest in Yeats as well. And my central argument in that book was that Yeats' poetry benefited from the backdrop provided by the Ireland in which he lived, a country that underwent profound political transformation during Yeats' lifetime. I also presented Yeats' life and work as a fountain of insight into the era in Ireland that turned out to be instrumental in the making of today's Ireland. Now, George Russell, of course, was Yeats' contemporary. But I would make the point that their engagement with Ireland was very, very different. Yeats, for much of his life, lived in London. He was a regular visitor to Ireland, but essentially his life was London-centred, whereas AE spent all of his time rooted in Dublin, enmeshed for a quarter century in the demanding work of producing two great journals, the Irish Homestead and the Irish Statesman. We had an opportunity to have a look at today at Plunkett House. Now, I would say that Yeats, Roy Foster, in his book, his great biography of Yeats, referred to him as the arch-poet. And he was an arch-poet, because it seems to me Yeats had just enough of an entanglement with Irish public life to enhance his writing. And I would say that AE probably had too much involvement with the public life of Ireland, which I think took away from his ability to be the kind of writer that Yeats clearly was. AE largely separated his poetry from temporal concerns. In my view, to the detriment of the poetry, because when he did write about the public square, the public world, the world of public affairs, he wrote very well about those issues. But there are very few poems in that vein in the AE catalogue. The same is true with mysticism. He dabbled in mysticism, but it was almost like mysticism gave him metaphors for poetry. Again, I think AE was more of a genuine mystic, and that probably also made his poetry more challenging for people who picked up his verse and dipped into it. So I think you could write a book with the title George Russell and the Ireland of his time. And this evening's talk can be seen, I think, as an executive summary of the kind of book that I think George Russell deserves to have written about him. Now, my argument is that George Russell was a significant figure in Ireland during the first third of the 20th century as a cultural nationalist, an advocate of agricultural cooperation, an active and effective commentator on national issues, and a dedicated editor of 2 influential weekly publications. His reputation, I think, has suffered from him being a contemporary of W.B. Yeats, because most people would, let's face it, would pale in comparison to Yeats, the great master of the late Romantic lyric and the 20th century elegy. Now, I've been interested in George Russell's work since I studied UCC back in the 1970s. And I was looking for a thesis topic. I studied history and literature in my BA, and I was looking for an MA topic. I was going to do an MA under the great Professor Joseph Lee, who I was his first MA student when he arrived, like a whirlwind from Cambridge, when he arrived in UCC in 1975, and I was his first master's student in those days. And in fact, I then had the pleasure, the honour of being present at a seminar held in his honour at New York University when I was ambassador in the United States, and when Jodie was leaving NYU after 15 years as Professor of Irish Studies at Glucksman Ireland House at New York University. And I've had the pleasure of contributing a chapter to a book that will come out in honour of Jodie's great career, coming out next in October of this year. Now, it was when I came up with this idea of doing a thesis about W.B. Yeats's Irish nationalism, his, Yeats as an Irish nationalist, because I thought that was a neglected aspect of Yeats's work. So when I was looking into Yeats, I came across A.E. and initially I probably saw him as depicted in James Joyce's Ulysses as a writer of what Joyce said, quote, dreamy, cloudy, symbolistic verse. Qualities that Joyce jokingly attributed to A.E.'s vegetarianism, producing poetic waves in the brain, as Joyce wrote in Ulysses. So, but I quickly realized that there was a lot more to A.E.'s public face than there was to Yeats's public face, because Yeats was a regular contributor, a regular commentator on Irish affairs. He wrote a lot of letters to the papers and took a position on a lot of things that a writer would normally be expected to comment on. But he was in the Halfpenny place compared with A.E., who was every week putting pen to paper and trying to provide guidance to the people who read the Irish Homestead and the Irish Statesman. So, like Yeats, A saw a connection between literature and nationality. Now that, of course, that connection is not obvious. There are probably many writers that you would say, well, they don't really have a particularly strong national identity. But in the Ireland of the late 19th century, national identity became a bigger deal. And for the writers of that period, Yeats and A included, this connection was made between literature and nationality. So, A wrote an essay called Nationality and Cosmopolitanism in Literature. And you could guess, I think, that A was in favour of nationality, not a great fan of cosmopolitanism. And Yeats had the same general view, I would say. So, A believed that to reveal Ireland in clear and beautiful light, to create the Ireland in the heart, that is the province of national literature. So, he made a strong case for literature to be national, to have a national purpose. He was very much in tune with the zeitgeist of the late 19th century. He wrote the following: the gods have returned to Erin and have centred themselves in the sacred mountains and blow the fires throughout the country. So his mysticism was combined with an enthusiasm for Irish identity and Irish nationality. He believed there was a special spirit in Ireland's distant past, one that retained its relevance. Yeats had the same idea, that there was something special about the Gaelic past that made it relevant to the modern world. He saw, he wrote about that Ireland was the last hope for idealism against what he called the moral leprosy of the modern world and the vulgarity of the modern mind as he saw it. And Yeats had very similar ideas. So, A's life changed when he became active in the cooperative movement. He showed himself to have a strong practical streak, travelled around the west of Ireland promoting the virtues of agricultural cooperation. He also gained a knowledge of the living conditions in the west of Ireland, which, as he said, were a disgrace to humanity. His exposure to this wild country, as he called it, in the west of Ireland, sowed the seeds of his lifelong belief in the value of agricultural cooperation as a means of redressing Ireland's economic ills. So, unlike many of those who idealised the peasantry or the people of rural Ireland, he actually knew them. He spent time with them. He knew all about them. So he had a much more realistic appreciation of rural Ireland than many others who maybe had a sort of a romantic notion of the Gael of the west of Ireland. So he engaged with unique intensity and persistence in Irish public life at a critical time in our country's development. No other writer of literary merit could match A.E.'s record for 25 years, churning out brilliant prose, but on often mundane, workaday topics. He immersed himself in the detail of some highly unprepossessing topics. Manure was a frequent subject of his pen. Cooperative purchase of plants. Imagine that. Marketing of fruit. Milk drying. And I came across a series of articles entitled The Butter Situation. We heard about that today from others. But my favourite example of A's Irish homestead journalism is a column he wrote in 1919 on the organisation of the dressed meat trade, which argues, and by the way, very perceptive, argues against the export of live animals and in favour of slaughtering and meat processing in Ireland to generate jobs and prosperity at home. This is precisely what the modern Irish food industry has done. He also argued for national and democratic control of Irish industries. Didn't have much faith in Irish business either. He thought that if they were given a sufficiently tempting offer, they would, quote, fall to it like a salmon to the fly of the fisherman. So he believed that our entrepreneurs would sell out to the highest bidder very quickly rather than keeping their heads down. So even though many of the arguments that A.E. preached in the Homestead, the virtues of economic self-sufficiency and so forth, were very similar to what D.P. Moran, the Irish Islander, was producing in the Leader, even though Moran didn't have much time for A.E. and A.E. didn't have much time for Moran either. In fact, Moran dismissively referred to A.E. as the hairy fairy because of his interest in fairies and the fact that he had a lot of facial hair. And of course, Moran also attacked Yeats on a regular basis as well. But nonetheless, A.E.'s actual economic outlook was very similar to Moran's. Believed that there should be more emphasis on the economic development of Ireland. Now, whereas Yeats was active in public affairs very early on in his life, A.E. really kept his own counsel for quite a long time and didn't, for example, Yeats was out there protesting against the Boer War. He was the president of the 1798 Centenary Commemoration Commission in 1898. He was a public critic of the visit of Queen Victoria, the visit of Edward the Seventh to Ireland in 1903. So he was engaged in controversy. He was involved, maybe through Mulhall and others, in quasi-Fenian activities, I would say. Whereas he kept his counsel, kept his head down, because I think he saw himself as having responsibility towards the cooperative movement, not to become involved in partisan politics. But that all changed in the second decade of the 20th century. The first example of AE becoming more out there on political topics was when Rudyard Kipling wrote a pretty disgraceful poem, a polemical poem, supporting the Ulster Volunteer Force and condemning the Nationalist Ireland as a bunch of murderers and thieves and so forth. It's pretty, if you read the poem, you can find it online. It's a pretty wild piece of poetic polemic, and he got stuck into it, shall we say? He got stuck into it. He responded with a lengthy critique of Kipling's views, basically saying, and I just quote this line. He said, "I set my knowledge, the knowledge of a lifetime, against your ignorance." So he accused Kipling of being ignorant about Ireland and of being malign towards Ireland. And he made a point that his own experience was that he had encountered nothing but tolerance from those of his Catholic countrymen, despite his own exotic preferences, his exotic religious preferences, in that, travelling in the west of Ireland, he'd come across many members of the Catholic clergy who proved to be congenial company. Now, there might not have been an ideal company for him, but certainly he was welcomed, and I think never found himself to be the butt of criticism because of his unconventional religious outlook. In 1913, he took considerable risk by publicly identifying with the Dublin workers during the lockout of that year. He spoke and wrote passionately in their defence, and bravely took aim at some of the most influential elements in Irish society, at the Dublin business community, at the Catholic hierarchy, and the Irish Parliamentary Party, all of whom he saw as being biased and malign towards the Dublin workers. He thought that the poverty of Dublin workers was making, and I quote, industrial civilization stir like a quaking bog. And he warned the city's employers that the democratic power would ultimately wrest control of industry from them if they didn't make compromise with the workers of Dublin during that lockout year of 1913. Because of his support, and he went to London and spoke at the Royal Albert Hall alongside George Bernard Shaw and James Connolly. And this, of course, gave him a connection with Connolly, and he saw an overlap between Connolly's urban socialism and his own ideals for rural Ireland. He later referred to Connolly in one of his poems as "my man who cast the last torch on the pile." He sought to help Connolly's widow emigrate to America in the period after her husband's execution in 1916. He believed that the roots of the Easter Rising lay in the grievances of Dublin's poor. He viewed the Rising as, quote, one of the most tragic episodes in Irish history. And although he admired the willingness of the leaders of the Rising to sacrifice themselves in pursuit of their ideals, he also worried about the destructive impact of the Rising on Ireland's economic prospects, which he had laboured long to promote. He believed that cooperation could permit Irish people from different political traditions to meet and unite in an economic brotherhood. In the Rising's aftermath, he was unrelenting in his pursuit of ways in which Ireland's divisions could be healed. He published The National Being in 1916, which is an extended piece of political writing in which he set out his blueprint for a cooperative commonwealth and the building of a distinctive Irish civilization. Ireland, he argued, needed fewer men of action and more scholars, economists and thinkers. Hear, hear, I say. Sorry, that was me, not him. Whose ideas could, quote, populate the desert depths of the national consciousness. So he believed that there was a need for people like him to engage in the kind of thinking that was necessary to try to create an image of the kind of Ireland that we could realistically hope to achieve in an independent Ireland. He said that we needed to spread national ideals, quote, in wide commonality over Ireland, if we are to create a civilization worthy of our hopes and our ages of struggle and sacrifice. In other words, we had made this huge sacrifice to forge an independent Ireland, but we needed to work out what that independent Ireland would look like. He was much more interested and concerned about what the future would look like rather than achieving this goal of independence. Independence was just the beginning of a process that should lead to a distinctive Irish civilization that would draw on the strengths of the ancient Irish tradition, but would also accommodate itself to the modern world. He recognized that a new politics had emerged after the Easter Rising. He knew that it derived its power not from any kind of grievance, but from a growing self-consciousness of nationality. In other words, he gradually became more and more aligned with the Sinn Féin view of Ireland's future following the Easter Rising. He wrote very persuasive letters to the British government on a number of topics, including one to Arthur Balfour, arguing that any settlement, excluding Ulster, would fail to satisfy the Ireland that has created so many imperial difficulties. So he was saying to Balfour, don't, whatever you do, don't opt for a settlement that divides Ireland. He proposed a scheme for self-government for Ireland, which would include a House of Lords equipped with veto powers, designed to reassure Ulster Unionists about their future in a home rule Ireland. He accepted an invitation to join the Irish Convention, set up by the British government in an effort to find an agreed settlement to Ireland's problems. He was included because Sinn Féin boycotted the convention, and AE was seen as someone who at least understood their point of view and could in some way represent the Sinn Féin point of view. He sought to produce a blueprint, a draft compromise for an all-Ireland dominion with autonomy for Ulster and the maintenance of the imperial connection. So, you know, the kind of a sensible, moderate compromise. All-Ireland dominion, a dominion for the whole of Ireland, with autonomy for Ulster and the maintenance of the imperial connection. This, of course, was turned down, and he then resigned from the convention because he took the view that there was no possibility of bridging the divide between the Ulster Unionist position on the one hand and the Sinn Féin position on the other, and he more and more became a supporter of the Sinn Féin cause. In December 1917, he made an impassioned plea for national unity, believing that, quote, there is but one powerful Irish character, not Celtic or Norman Saxon, but a new race. In other words, he believed there needed to be a new dispensation in Ireland. It couldn't just be one side dominate the other, but there had to be a new synthesis developed. Not Celtic or Norman Saxon, but a new race, a new Irish identity for the future. And he insisted that Ireland's animosities based on past history needed to be transcended in a new Ireland for the future. Now, this idea of bringing together the different traditions in Ireland, is reflected in his most ambitious public poem. I said that he didn't really write poems like Easter 1916, 1919, Meditation in Time of Civil War, which Yeats wrote all the time. Yeats was big into that kind of thing. Yeats was, or A was not. But he wrote this poem, which is one of the longest titles of any poem that I know. To the memory of some I knew who were dead and who loved Ireland. It had an even longer title earlier on, I think. But anyway, it's a long title. But it's a really fine poem, and it just, to me, it proves that had he addressed issues in the public domain in his poetry, it could have been quite good. It could have worked quite well for his poetry. But he wrote once about the politics of time and the politics of eternity, and for A.E., the politics of eternity, that was the subject matter for poetry, whereas the politics of time was his prose and his journalism. I think it might have been better for him had he at least spent some time addressing the politics of time in his poetry.